get now some analysis on this ruling. I'm joined by Sanusha Naidu, political analyst at this hour here on the Midday View on ENCA DSTV channel 403. Sanusha, good afternoon. Welcome to the Midday View. Well, there we have it. Many pundits and many commentators leading up to today's court ruling in this Magashule versus the ANC case had anticipated that he won't win it. So some people might say there's no surprise about it, or am I wrong?
Good afternoon, Dan, and to the viewers. I think you're not wrong. I think you the mood and the kind of impressions one got in terms of this application Mr. Magashule made to the court kind of indicated that he was asking the court in many ways to pronounce on the internal dynamics and processes of the party. Now, if you listen to the judgment that was read out earlier today, you get the sense that the court, and in that ruling, they were hesitant, because once you start delving and straying out of your lane into pronouncing on these internal matters, you then open up another area of litigation which becomes very complicated for you. It becomes much more complex, and it becomes much more difficult to navigate out of. So I think in listening to the judgment and in listening to what Mr. Magashule had asked the court to do, on all three counts, they've dismissed it. And they actually argued that the NEC, in my interpretation, and let me just preface this comment by saying that I'm not a legal expert, so this is just my interpretation and an ordinary interpretation of what I heard today, and that was the judgment was actually saying that between conferences, the NEC does have power. It is empowered. And of course, even if at the 27 NASREC conference, when you look at the resolution around the step-aside rule, you kind of get the sense it was very broad. So what the NEC kind of did was padded it a bit. And so 25.70 is not necessarily an unconstitutional rule in a way, but rather it is in line with how the ANC actually defines its internal process and how it can extend those, expand and give more detail to it. And so they set the rule.
Yeah, in fact, I think it says something to the fact that the National Executive Committee is the highest decision-making body between conferences and can expand its processes by getting more people on as a national working committee and so on. So it's very clear that the court was saying it's not for us really to make decisions about your internal workings, but from what we can interpret from the internal workings, there was nothing unlawful about your suspension, Mr. Magashule.
Indeed, Dan. And I think this is where we got to be really careful on how many things you can litigate on. When you start taking your own party to court to litigate on issues. And I think also more importantly, in the concluding remarks of the judgment, that was where the remarks were made in terms of saying this is a voluntary or association. So when you get into a voluntary association, you've got to also think about what is your kind of compact, your understanding of when you become a member of that institution as a voluntary association. What are the kinds of conduct, the kinds of rules, the kind of processes that you implicitly comply with? And so I think going down the line, this will be a very important judgment, not only for the ANC and in its internal dynamics, but also for perhaps other political entities, associations, etc., in terms of also giving some kind of precedent in case law around how they would have to think about this, whether they're going to go to the court to decide, you know what, I'm going to basically fight my political battle using the courts and litigation by political association or political dynamics. Yeah.
So Mr. Magashule, according to this court ruling, remains suspended as Secretary General. Of course, he might decide to appeal. That will be another leg. But for now, he remains suspended. The other one that was in front of this court was he went to apply, asking the court to say that his own suspension letter of President Ramaphosa that happened around the same time is valid. But the ruling was that it did not meet the mandatory requirements for a suspension of a president in terms of ANC's own rules and procedures.
Absolutely. So he kind of, if you want to put it in a very kind of cursory way, he was hoping that the court would see his interpretation of the issues. Unfortunately, it didn't come to that. They argued that you cannot go and try and write your own suspension letter because there was no criminal or offense that was, or some kind of legal offense that that President Ramaphosa had. So it kind of makes one wonder whether enough legal thought was put into the way in which this case was presented to the judges, whether there was enough legal understanding of whether you could take these three areas of what constituted Mr. Ace Magashule's case and say that there's merit to it. Because what really makes it very difficult now is you've got a court ruling and it's dismissed with cost. Again, we're coming back to this idea that you're getting these resources, you're using the court's time, they're dismissing it with cost, and then you're going back. And whether or not he's going to appeal it again it will be very interesting to see on what basis he appeals, because they seem to be very clear that this is about the interpretation of the process and of the rule, but it's also about the way the ANC does and applies and employs these rules internally.
Yeah, and very briefly, Sanusha, before we end, I know we're just out of time now, but I started the show by saying it's been a big week for the judiciary in how they've handled a number of these very hot issues, and there's really like kudos to them. And once again, the independence of the judiciary firmly stamping its authority, I guess, is very good for our constitutional democracy.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think that it showed that the rule of law prevails. It shows that the Constitution prevails. It shows that these avenues of our legal aspects of our body politic and our state is very much in a strengthened form, and they're applying it in the way that they do. I think we have to be very, very proud of that tradition of our democracy, and let's see what happens as we go forward.
Thank you very much. Sanusha Naidu, do you have some of your insights on that, one of those developing stories we've been watching for you today in the matter, in this case, of Mr. Ace Magashule and the ANC?